All right, class, I'd like to talk through the instructions I gave you on week 10 for your final exam. Uh, you know, I remember many years ago I preached through the Gospel of Mark, and I got to Mark 13, and I was rocked. One, at just how difficult that passage is. The Olivet Discourse is, in my opinion, maybe the most difficult passage in the New Testament. I think certainly the most difficult passage in the Gospels for interpretation, because there's layers to it. It's complex, and you may not realize how complex it is, and the implications that it has on so many other passages in the Scriptures, Old and New Testament, and other places in the New Testament, like Revelation, and just in general how you understand eschatology, prophecy, end times, and the future. So there's a lot to it. I don't expect you to resolve every issue or question. So I just want to talk through this because I want you to wrestle with this. So your final exam is an essay. As I've mentioned here, there is a great disagreement among scholars about the best interpretation of the discourse. You find it in each of the synoptic gospels: Matthew 24, Mark 13, and Luke 21. And as I have researched the passage over the years, I have come across four major, what can be rightly called, schools of interpretation. Four major views of how to interpret Jesus's words. The first one says that and some understand the events that Jesus is speaking of as having already occurred. That is, from our perspective, some would say that the discourse was and has been fulfilled in its entirety in the destruction of the temple by the Romans in the year AD 70, 40 years after Jesus' death and resurrection. And that did happen. Let's be very clear. It's very important that we understand that the second temple, the one that Jesus was cleansing and they were visiting in the Gospels, that temple was destroyed 40 years after Jesus' death and resurrection and ascension. And that was clearly a judgment on Israel. The veil was torn in two from top to bottom, right, at Jesus' death. But it would seem that the Jews continued to worship there. They continued to act as though the Messiah had not come. And so I would assume they put the veil back up. Well, at that point, the temple becomes obsolete because the temple, Jesus refers to himself, his body, as the temple that they would destroy in 3 days, and in 3 days he would raise it up again. So in that sense, Jesus is the fulfillment of the temple. And so some would say, well, what Jesus was speaking of, and not one stone standing on another, that happened in AD 70. And so what Jesus is describing is a prophecy that had not happened when he spoke it. And then, when he spoke it, it was fulfilled 40 years later. And so what we're reading is fulfilled prophecy and views it entirely in the past. So that's one interpretation. A second school of interpretation, some see the events the very opposite, something entirely future. That is, they are entirely about what will happen at Jesus' second coming. And so others look at it and say, no, what Jesus is speaking of is something that has not happened yet. It's entirely in the future when he returns in judgment at his second coming, something that from the time that he spoke it until its fulfillment has now been at least 2,000 years, and maybe much longer, should the Lord tarry. Number 3, others think that some of the discourse, perhaps the first half, describes past events and refers to AD 70, and the other half refers to the future, the second coming. And so the first view said it's all past, second view says it's all future. Third view says half of it's past, half of it's future. You'll have to research, read, think, study that view. Fourth, and lastly, some view the events described as something, you notice I italicized primarily, something primarily in the past, something that happened in AD 70, while understanding those same events to serve secondarily as a reflection or a foreshadowing of similar events in the future at the second coming. So in this sense, it's almost like two layers. It happened. It was primarily in 70, but it has a future aspect, another layer to it, and so there's a primary, secondary fulfillment. So all past, all future, half past, half future, all past, but with a foreshadowing to the future. Now, I will say that the first view is often referred to as a preterist position, which is sometimes consistent with a preterist interpretation of the book of Revelation that views it as past. The second view sees it as future, is a futurist interpretation of Revelation, and is consistent with a dispensational, premillennial, pre-tribulational position. And then others see half past, half future. I believe that Dr. Don Carson holds that position. And then the fourth position, primary, secondary, I believe is held by Sam Storms as one example. And I've given you some resources by him and links by him. So what I want you to do is to compare and contrast the views with one another. So compare and contrast the views with one another. And finally, I want you to defend the viewpoint that you believe to be the most reasonable and biblically consistent. You notice I have this in all bold. I'm looking for comparisons. I'm looking for contrasts. How are they alike? How are they different? Where do you see strengths? Where do you see weaknesses? And then I want you to say, okay, these are the views. Here are some of the pros and cons of the views. And then here's where I land. And then tell me why. And then support it. What do you believe, and why do you believe that your particular position is the correct one? Now, you may come to a school of interpretation that's different from one of those four, but you're going to have to defend that. These four I've given you are the four major views that I have seen, and I don't know of any other major interpretations than these four. So if you come across one and you think it's correct, let me know. I'd love to know about it. So some additional considerations. I chose this particular discourse as your final for a number of reasons. First, this discourse comes near the end of Jesus' earthly ministry. And so you've been reading through the Gospels chronologically over the duration of this quarter, and I trust that you've noticed that the disciples are quite slow to understand Jesus throughout his ministry. And so hopefully now after 9, nearly 10 weeks of reading slowly through the Gospels, you've seen that even though the disciples have rightly understood Jesus' identity and made the great confession at Caesarea Philippi, they continue to misunderstand the biblical role of the Messiah as a suffering servant. They fail to grasp the concept of the crucifixion all the way up until the day that it happens, really. And so you need to keep that in mind as you study the discourse. And just think, if the disciples at the point of the cross didn't even really grasp the cross, then, and that was the purpose of his first coming, how likely is it that they would have fully understood the second coming at this point? Would they have understood the second coming when they didn't understand really the first coming yet? Something to think about. Also, your interpretation of who this generation is in Matthew 24:34. Jesus said, this generation will not pass away until all these things take place. So, this generation, what generation? What does this generation mean? What does it refer to? And so that's going to greatly affect your conclusion about the discourse. Second, each of the gospel accounts of the discourse begins with clear language that the temple that Jesus was referring to, that would not have one stone upon another, is the one they've just left, the one they're at that moment standing outside of looking back at from the vantage point of the Mount of Olives. So keep that immediate context in mind as you read it, and read slowly through it, and ask yourself, to whom is Jesus speaking and referring when he uses the pronoun you, Y-O-U? Third, this is a text, as I said, that has great implications for rightly interpreting other portions of Scripture. So I chose this because as a student of the Gospels myself, it's important that we wrestle with difficult texts. And in my case, I came to a different conclusion than the one I had always heard growing up. And so I just want you to be thoughtful and to learn to wrestle with Scripture in a way that causes you to push back on just what's familiar to you, and don't just immediately assume that everything you've always heard is correct. It may be, but don't do so blindly. Don't accept anything blindly. Study the Scriptures for yourself. I also mentioned that fourth, you may or may not find the precise wording I have used to describe the four options for interpretation in various resources. As I said, those are the four possibilities that I've come across. But even if you cannot find a particular resource defending each viewpoint, I want you to still interact with each of those interpretations as I have described it based on your own overall study and understanding of the passage. Now, as far as grading goes, I want to be clear. You will not be graded, and your grade will not depend on arriving at what I think is the correct interpretation. Many of you probably have never studied this passage in depth. You may never have heard it even taught in depth to you. And so it would not be right for me to grade you on necessarily the right interpretation. That's not my goal in this. It's not you necessarily getting the right answer. It's on you demonstrating that you know how to research. You know how to study. You know how to read thoughtfully, carefully, and not just be defensive when your own presuppositions and familiar interpretations are perhaps challenged. I want you to show me that you thoroughly researched the discourse. Interact with the possibilities. Show me that you thought hard about this. And you're going to continue to wrestle with this probably for years to come. And my goal is to launch you into that journey. By the way, one of the resources I mentioned here, Ken Gentry, Dr. Gentry actually lives down in the upstate of South Carolina and is, I believe, a pastor at a conservative Presbyterian church near Spartanburg. He would hold the more of a preterist interpretation, the first school of interpretation. So that's just a good reference to know as well. The length of the essay, I know this probably frustrates some. It's open-ended. I'm not putting a page limit on it, a minimum or a maximum, but I am want to tell you, I think it would be difficult to do what I'm asking with comparing and contrasting the views and defending your view and showing your research and your arguments for and against and pros and cons without a few pages probably. So please submit your final draft single-spaced Times New Roman 12-point font. I've got that in your notes here. So I've given you some suggested resources. You're not required to footnote, but I am obviously saying do not plagiarize someone's work. I want to read your words. If you're quoting someone, if you're taking concepts and ideas from someone, you need to reword them into your own language, your own words. And then at the end of your paper, please show me what resources you used for your study. Now, I'll give, of course, extra grading consideration for those who go out of their way and choose to footnote or show me in the body of the essay where I could find support for your arguments. But you can use any credible resources you can find. Just show me where you found them. And if you're using online resources, make sure that they're quality resources, not Wikipedia. Use, theological journals, articles from reputable sources, notable writers, and such. So I hope that you have already been reading, researching, wrestling, thinking across the quarter with this assignment. And then you'll submit it to me online under final exam submission. And you need to do so by before midnight, Friday, June 7th. All right. Thank you for your work. And if you have any questions, just send me a message. God bless you.